It's Wednesday, January 14th, 2026. Denaturalize and deport. That is the game. Updates from Iran, and the Secret Service has a mess on its hands. Next on the AM Update. President Trump spoke to a group of business people from Detroit, Michigan, yesterday, and said it's time to start denaturalizing and deporting some individuals in this country.
We're also going to revoke the citizenship of any naturalized immigrant from Somalia or anywhere else who is convicted of defrauding our citizens. We're going to get them the hell out of here fast. And if you come to America to rob Americans, we're throwing you in jail and we're sending you back to the place from where you came.
Yes, I can't wait to see that when it happens. Hopefully it does happen. That has to be the name of the game here. It's not just deporting the worst of the worst criminals, although that is important. We also need to denaturalize and deport those who are here, quote unquote, legally. Also, President Trump added this regarding sanctuary states and sanctuary cities.
We're giving 90-day notices to places like California, Scott. Right away, we're going to send out that notice. Who would bill the federal government as people poured into the state to send those people back because no country can afford to do it. No country can afford to take in millions of people, pay for their education, their health care, their hospitals. You just can't do it. And we all have a heart. You can't do it. But many of those people are murderers. They're people released from jails, prisons, mental institutions, insane asylums. They're people that are drug dealers. They're addicts. Additionally, starting February 1st, we're not making any payments to sanctuary cities or states having sanctuary cities because they do everything possible to protect criminals at the expense of American citizens, and it breeds fraud and crime and all of the other problems that come. So we're not making any payment to anybody that supports sanctuary cities.
That's good, and that should have been done day one as well, because you see the riots we had in Los Angeles last year. You see some of the fracases we've seen in places like Minneapolis ongoing. You wonder why you see some of that friction there as opposed to blue cities in red states like even Memphis or Houston, or take your pick of other ICE operations in red states. It's because they're not sanctuary states, and so they don't have the protection of the state government to do whatever they want to gum up the works in those aforementioned areas. So yes, that should have happened a long time ago. Glad the change is being made now. A couple of cases heard oral arguments at the Supreme Court yesterday morning dealing with the future of dudes who feel pretty who want to compete on sports teams against your daughters, your little girls. Of course, we can't go through a case like this without hearing from Ketanji, I'm not a biologist, Brown Jackson.
You have the overarching classification, everybody has to be, play on the team that is the same as their sex at birth. But then you have a gender identity definition that is operating within that, meaning a distinction, meaning that for cisgender girls, they can play consistent with their gender identity. For transgender girls, they can't.
So if you're wondering what a cisgender girl is, a cisgender girl, according to Ketanji Brown Jackson, what's the difference between a cisgender and a transgender? I know that's probably the burning question on your mind. Well, the difference between a cisgender and a transgender, to answer that question, you'd have to figure out what the exchange rate is between Schrute and Stanley Nichols, and then divide that by the airspeed velocity of an unladen African swallow. I'm sure you're just dying to know the answer. What is a cisgender? I don't know what any of these are. There's only boys and girls, men and women, human beings. And yet we complicate things so much because, of course, Miss Brown Jackson, you're not a biologist, as you said during your confirmation hearing. I am an equal opportunity critic of the Supreme Court, though. Amy Coney Barrett called boys who pretend to be girls, she called them trans girls yesterday during oral arguments. Not good. Core U.S. consumer prices rose less than predicted in December, reinforcing hopes inflation is tempering as the Federal Reserve contemplates its next move on interest rates. Excluding volatile food and energy prices, the Consumer Price Index showed a seasonally adjusted 0.2% gain on a monthly basis and 2.6% annually. Again, that's under expectations. It still means, though, that prices are going up, and it's still not the 2% inflation that is the target of the Federal Reserve and one of the targets broadly held by economists before they feel good about cutting interest rates any further. It is good news nonetheless. Energy prices still elevated. Food prices, beef notwithstanding, food prices in a lot of areas are heading downwards, led by the price of eggs, which is definitely an answer to prayer for my family. We go through a lot of eggs indeed. We now turn our attention to Iran, where the Crown Prince in exile, Reza Pahlavi, sat down for an interview with CBS News, where he was asked if he sees any cracks in the regime.
There has been cracks in the regime. Defections are beginning to occur. In fact, as I said, there have been an outreach of elements that I've already said that are prepared to do that at significant levels of authority, both in the armed forces side as well as the civilians. They know that this regime is on the verge of collapse. They need to be ensured that they can really have a place in the transition, a place beyond this regime. And that's exactly the kind of dialogue we have with those elements. Khamenei, the first thing that happened during the 12-day war, he was hitting on the ground in a bunker. They are gearing up to escape from the country. They're loading up planes to take off and maybe end up in exiling themselves. That's how close it is.
There is Reza Pahlavi. He is the Crown Prince in exile of Iran, saying that very shortly you're going to see some mass defections from the Iranian regime. He believes that's how close the regime is to collapse. This comes as news from some sources, including Iran International, that the killings of protesters by the regime could be upwards of between 12,000 and 20,000 in the last 4 or 5 days. Incredible. Of course, information slow to trickle out of Iran for obvious reasons, though. In the last 48 hours or so, it does sound like mysteriously some telecommunications have begun to come back online. A source inside Iran, speaking to CBS News, who was able to call out, said that activist groups working to compile a full death toll from the protests based on reports from medical officials across the country believe the toll is at least 12,000 dead. Just the regime murdering people as a last gasp. According to the Wall Street Journal, this was interesting as well. China and their friendship with Iran starting to meet some limits here. China has delayed a 2021 deal between the two countries, a $400 billion deal, due to sanction fears. Beijing views Iran as an energy source, not a core ally, and fearful right now that any sort of deals with Iran from an energy or business standpoint, could be met with sanctions from the United States and Europe. So they're kind of standing pat. So at least Beijing seems to think that the fall or collapse could be imminent. Here is President Trump once more in Detroit, Michigan.
You have a message for the leaders currently of Iran.
Yeah, the message is they've got to show humanity. They've got a big problem, and I hope they're not going to be killing people. And I'm going to have a report very soon. It would seem to me that they have been badly misbehaving, but that is not confirmed.
You have a message for the leaders.
There's President Trump's message for the leadership of Iran. Again, more yesterday morning, President Trump saying and telling the protesters help is on the way. Quickly this before the break. The Secret Service has a mess on its hands. Thanks once again to Project Veritas.
Can I see your badge again with your photo? You're so cute.
A current Secret Service agent on Vice President J.D. Vance's security detail.
When he's like walking, like where are you?
If you follow him, we'll have at least a minimum head and
gives away vital high-level security information to our undercover journalists.
We have different shifts. We have shift.
Tells her about detailed future travel plans for the Vice President, and even sends her pictures with location metadata revealing where the President's convoy was located, potentially violating both the Secret Service NDA and United States federal law. And Thomas is fully aware of this. Quote, I sign paperwork, so if I don't have to get out information, I never do, otherwise I get in trouble. You really have to stand in awe of the lack of self-awareness.
They know secret about what we do.
Thomas Scotto also reveals that he voted for Biden and that he hates Trump and Vance's immigration policies.
Did you vote for Biden?
Yes, I did actually.
No, What do you think about like all the ICE stuff going on?
Yeah, I hate that shit.
Yeah.
There is a man, a Secret Service agent, Thomas Scotto, falling for yet another Project Veritas honeypot. I'm just saying I hate ICE. I voted for Joe Biden. Here is where the vice president is going to be. Here, and here. Also, I totally know that if I divulge information like this, I could get in a lot of trouble. My goodness, what a mess. And the Secret Service admitted as much yesterday afternoon. They released a statement admitting that Mr. Scotto's behavior caught on undercover camera by Project Veritas falls short of standards. Yeah, you're telling me. When we come back, we go to Columbus, Ohio. More scams being exposed, allegedly. Also, Muslim Brotherhood. We're maybe crossing a Rubicon in terms of dealing with them the way that they should be dealt with. And Rand Paul goes on the Joe Rogan experience. We'll talk about all that and more coming up next.
Oye. Unga! I'm being screamed at in some kind of Swahili.
That is the voice of former Major League Baseball pitcher John Rocker, who visited a taxpayer-funded daycare in Columbus, Ohio, named Manadinaka Child Care Learning Center.
Come here. Film there. Oh. All right, here we go. Here comes the costume. My wife dropped my son off at this location. I need to come pick him up for a doctor's appointment. Yes, here.
So what's his name?
LeBron.
LeBron? We don't have that time.
No, unless my wife's lying to me.
No, I'm not an officer.
I need any evidence. If you have any evidence.
Evidence? No, I'm a reporter.
No, absolutely no.
So there is former MLB pitcher John Rocker, along with an independent journalist in Columbus, Ohio, visiting the Manadanika Child Care Learning Center. Said there were no kids there. The only person at that child care learning center was an employee, allegedly, who just yelled at them in a foreign language until they realized, oh, you're not cops, and then just yelled at them some more. How widespread is this whole daycare fraud? Seems pretty widespread. The U.S. has designated 3 branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorist organizations in a move that could impact Washington's relationships with Qatar and Turkey. Treasury and State Departments announced the moves against the Lebanese, Jordanian, and Egyptian chapters of the group, which the Trump administration asserts pose risks to the United States. The State Department gave the Lebanese branch of the Muslim Brotherhood the most severe of its labels, designating it a foreign terrorist organization, which makes it illegal to provide material support to the group. Additionally, the Treasury Department labeled the Jordanian and Egyptian branches as specially designated global terrorists for providing support to Hamas. The Lebanese chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood was also given a special designation by the Treasury Department. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in a statement, quote, "These designations reflect the opening actions of an ongoing, sustained effort to thwart Muslim Brotherhood chapters' violence and destabilization where it occurs. The United States will use all available tools to deprive these Muslim Brotherhood chapters of the resources to engage in or support terrorism." The labeling of the Jordanian chapter as a specially designated global terrorist comes months after Amman announced a sweeping ban on the organization. The Associated Press noted that while the Jordanian monarchy had previously banned the Muslim Brotherhood a decade ago, it officially licensed a splinter group and continued to tolerate the Islamic Action Front while restricting some of its activities. So, Finally, again, that seems to be a theme on today's episode, doing the right thing, taking the right course when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood and labeling them what they are, just a front for a terrorist network and organization. Let's go to this. Senator Rand Paul went on the Joe Rogan experience. Been a while since we've heard from Senator Paul, it seems like, on virtually any issue. Talked about the ongoing legacy of Dr. Anthony Fauci. Yes, he still deserves all of the jabs he gets. No pun intended.
So in the first month of this, maybe first or second month, Fauci comes in and I said, many people who die from the flesh-eating bacteria, which is not the same, but it's a serious illness, what they give them to try to treat them to prevent death and loss of limbs is high-dose IV steroids. And I had a friend whose life was saved. He didn't lose any of his limbs, and he had this terrible illness. And so I asked Anthony Fauci, I said, do you think there's a chance, as they're getting very, very sick and their lungs are filling up with fluid, that we could try high-dose IV steroids like we do in other infections? And he said, oh, no, we've tried that. Turns out, and we mentioned this in the book, the best treatment when you are just about to go on the ventilator or on the ventilator, when you have a 50% chance of dying at that point, was IV steroids, an old generic medicine that Big Pharma doesn't make much money off of.
Which steroids in particular were they using?
It's called Solumedrol, but it's just IV steroids. And it was a 36% reduction in death, which is pretty significant when you're in the ICU. The people in the ICU were very, very sick. It was a third of them had a reduction in death by taking IV steroids. But he was dismissing it from the very beginning and already acting like, oh, I know it's not going to work, and we're going to try remdesivir, which turned out not to work very well.
Not only that, it gives people kidney failure.
So there is Senator Rand Paul on the Joe Rogan Experience, once again reprising a story that I had not heard before about early on in the pandemic, or the scamdemic, probably more precisely, detailing how he talked to Anthony Fauci about just giving an old school steroid to people to help inflammation go down. Could that help? And Anthony Fauci said, heck no. Heck no, that's not going to help. Still waiting on Anthony Fauci to face any sort of accountability. Of course, Joe Biden pardoned him preemptively for ambiguous reasons before leaving office. And now here's this. Samuel Alito, while we still have him, it is a blessing to hear from him. Here he is arguing with an ACLU attorney by the name of Kathleen Hartnett on the issue of gender and sexuality pertaining to the case that heard oral arguments yesterday at the Supreme Court on dudes who feel pretty competing in athletics against your daughters. Listen to this.
Is it not necessary for there to be, for equal protection purposes, if that is challenged under the Equal Protection Clause, an understanding of what it means to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman?
Yes, Your Honor.
And what is that definition? For equal protection purposes, what does it mean to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman?
Sorry, I misunderstood your question. I think that the underlying enactment, whatever it was, the policy, the law, we'd have to have an understanding of how the state or the government was understanding that term to figure out whether or not someone was excluded. We do not have a definition for the court. And we don't take issue with we're not disputing the definition here. What we're saying is that the way it applies in practice is to exclude birth sex males categorically from women's teams, and that there's a subset of those birth sex males where it doesn't make sense to do so according to the state's own interest.
Well, how can a court determine whether there's discrimination on the basis of sex without knowing what sex means for equal protection purposes?
I think here we just know we basically know that that they've identified pursuant to their own statute.
It's just madness from that ACLU attorney. Hey, can you define, for the purpose of discrimination, for the purpose of equal protection, man, woman, boy, girl? And you heard the ACLU attorney there, Kathleen Hartnett, say, quote, we do not have a definition. And he pressed a little bit more, and she's just in shambles because it's an indefensible position. If you can't even determine, you can't even actually define what it is you're talking about, you're never going to be able to win any argument whatsoever. That's absolutely nuts. When we come back for one final segment, Pascal's wager, not advisable, but is that really what we saw with Scott Adams? Talk about that coming up next. And now here's this. Scott Adams, creator of Dilbert and a political commentator, passed away yesterday at the age of 68 after a battle with prostate cancer. We played this clip last week where he discussed and said, hey, my Christian audience, those of my audience who are believers in Christ, They keep trying to get me to convert to Christianity, and I just want to let you know I will do that before I go. He said, I understand it's never too late. And my admonition to Scott Adams or anybody in his position, whether or not they're on their, last lap, last couple of steps of that last lap, it's never too early either. Well, yesterday, Scott Adams passed away. And he released a statement. And it was read by his first ex-wife on his live stream yesterday. I want to read it for you. This is his final message. He wrote this on January 1st of this year, and he knew that he was going to be gone soon. This is the first thing that he wrote in his final message to everyone. Quote, if you are reading this, things did not go well for me. I have a few things to say before I go. My body failed before my brain. I am of sound mind as I write this, January 1st, 2026. If you wonder about any of my choices or my estate or anything else, please know I am free of any coercion or inappropriate influence of any sort, I promise. Next, many of my Christian friends have asked me to find Jesus before I go. I'm not a believer, but I have to admit the risk-reward calculation for doing so looks attractive. So here I go. I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I look forward to spending an eternity with him. The part about me not being a believer should be quickly resolved if I wake up in heaven. I won't need any more convincing than that, and I hope I am still qualified for entry. With your permission, I'd like to explain something about my life. And he goes into a long explanation, a long expose, and it's beautiful, well written. Expect nothing less from Scott Adams. But that was the first thing that he wanted to convey in his last message to his audience, to his loved ones. I just want to say this morning, number one, there's a tendency, especially if you are a believer, to rush to say, oh no, he just did a version of Pascal's wager. I think that's true. But I would caution you to maybe not make any definitive proclamations, as I'm trying not to myself, about where Scott Adams is right now. God, in his infinite wisdom and his infinitely perfect wisdom, will work out cases like this perfectly. I do trust that. It's water under the bridge now in terms of what ministering any of us could do to Scott Adams or the next or the last Scott Adams. There is still much to be determined about whoever the next Scott Adams is who is at a place like this in his life. Maybe you know somebody like that who is not a believer, who maybe is reconsidering things on the last lap. However, I would just say this. I don't know Scott Adams well, never consumed a lot of his content. First time I think I ever heard of him was about 10 years ago. He was one of the first people to, and I thought he was nuts. I thought he was crazy because I was a never Trumper back then. But he was one of the first people, and I don't think he was ever really that much of a Trump fan, but he was one of the first people to diagnose and to see the MAGA movement. He was one of the first persons to go on the record and say, I think he's going to win in 2016. And he sounded crazy, but he was right. He's a very sharp-witted individual. 2 marriages, 2 failed marriages. In fact, to the extent that I did consume any of his content, I found him a little abrasive, slightly arrogant. I just want to say this. If my inclination about him is correct, and I do think he is his own man for sure. If my inclination or read on him is anywhere near correct, that he's just kind of a hard-headed dude. Because that's kind of what it sounds like, based on his marriages, based on what I've seen from him. The fact that the first thing he wants to say in his last message is, quote, I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I look forward to spending an eternity with him, that indicates a level of humility. Now, humility is not what gets you into heaven. It's not what starts a relationship with your Maker. Faith, abiding deep faith that produces good works, That's more of an indication of that. But none of us truly know what Scott Adams' motivation was. Maybe it truly was a cognitive, an intellectual Pascal's wager, or some variation of that. Maybe. Or maybe it was true faith. That a guy who had made his own way in life finally humbled himself and admitted, even on his last step of his last lap, that I'm not my Lord and Savior. I'm not a Lord of anything. Jesus is. So, all that is to say, number one, if you're in the position that we talked about, where you're kind of like Scott Adams, it's never too late. I'll do that right before I die. No, today is the day of salvation. It's never too early either. And I would advise against trying to do any form of Pascal's wager. Not that I know for sure where Scott Adams is right now. But number two, for those of you who are quite certain that he is not up above and probably somewhere down below, I would urge you that's probably not profitable to say that, because ultimately God is going to be the judge, as he will be for all of us. To pray for Scott Adams, his loved ones, his friends, everybody who enjoyed him, that they too would know their maker, and hopefully long before their dying day. That's going to do it for a Wednesday. Back at it again tomorrow. I'm Aaron McIntyre, and this is the AM Update.